cases? Please raise the hand. Very few, there were like 2 or 3, so if I now do a calculation percentage-wise, it's a very low percentage. It's probably not even 1%. This actually confirms, at least my experience when I talk to customers, and it also confirms, let's say all the research work from analysts, that when you look at IT organizations, there's a significant demand and there's just not enough budget to fulfill this demand. When there was the crisis, then the budget especially was even wasn't even being flat or increasing slightly, it was even declining, which made the gap even bigger. And on the other side, the demand in IT is not declining, okay? Because even when there was the crisis. So the demand in IT keeps increasing, not just due to more requirements on performance and scalability and so on, but also in terms of expectation to a CIO. Because the experience all of us have actually in the private life with Google, with Twitter, with Facebook, actually create also kind of a higher expectation to the performance of an IT of a company. So there's even more pressure on the CIO. So we are convinced that closing this huge gap between the high demand and the limited budget cannot be achieved anymore with doing things the old-fashioned way, by improving a little bit on this side, renegotiating the license agreement with a software supplier, by another 5%, and doing the small things. It will not cut it to close this big gap which exists out there. So one thing which helps closing the gap is technology. So on one side we have still Moore's law, which is helping, to a certain extent, but it's not closing this gap completely. So we are convinced 3 things, need to happen or will help significantly closing this gap. That's what I want to talk about this. First, an increased adoption of open source as a software development model. And I will talk about this in a little bit more detail. Second, we need to have a different business model. The business model of the past, with classical proprietary software company, license sell model, we don't think is anymore the business model of the future. I will talk in more details about this as well. And third but not last is cloud architectures. So we need different architectures to deliver IT services to the end, also close this gap. So we are convinced that with all these things together, that we can significantly, close this gap between this high demand and this limited budget. So let me go into a little bit more detail in the first bullet, or the second one, about open source. So open source is not a business model. Open source is just a different way of developing software. Not more, but also not less. Okay? It's a different way of developing software. In a way, developing software of attracting a community, or attracting people who work in the community and pretty much do work without being on your own payroll. Okay? So this is fundamentally, that's pretty much the principle, so that you have a factory which creates products, for a significant lower cost, which at the end is for a big benefit for the customers. So if you look at the record example, how do we create our software? There's communities out there, or there's hundreds or thousands of projects in the community. If you stick, for example, with Linux, where we have our Fedora, project, which is the Red Hat sponsored Linux distribution, or we take then certain projects out of the community, bundle this into a distribution, and this one gets tested, already in the community, and at a certain point in time, we freeze it and build an enterprise product out of it. The Linux Foundation estimated that if Fedora would have been developed in a closed source fashion, the development cost would equal $11 billion. We as Red Hat have roughly 1,500 developers, engineers. You can do the math. 1,500 developers on our payroll don't equal 11 billion. Okay? There's a big difference. So there's a huge leverage of the open source software development model, in reducing the cost of developing, at the end software. And now important is because we don't sell a license, we don't sell functionality, we sell added value, because the functionality gets created through a community process. At the end, there's significantly cost savings, for an end customer. Give you 2 customer examples where even specific customers participated in this project, in this way of developing software. JP Morgan Chase had already quite some time ago, a few years ago, a big problem around messaging. So what did they do? They were highly skilled engineers. They developed their own messaging product for their trading platform because speed, low latency, is of essence for them. So you have a bank, they developed software, it was working, but then they said, I'm a bank, I'm not a software company. I don't want to carry the burden of keep maintaining this software and developing it on an ongoing basis. So what did they do? They came to us and said, Red Hat, help me making an open source project out of the software which I created. I donate the code and you help me, creating a community around of it. So that JP Morgan can still be a user of the software, but don't carry the burden of the complete development cost. So we did this in the meantime, like amqp.org, that's a community which is called Advanced Messaging Queuing Protocol, got created, and it became kind of a common standard, for messaging, where, as one example, Deutsche Börse, the trading, company in Germany, for example, builds their new trading platforms exactly on this technology. So it was a customer-driven innovation, where then, we helped them make this an open source project, which now is, widely available and used in different, enterprise fashions. Very nice example. Another one is the NSA from the US, so National Security Agency from North America. They are pretty much the code keeper or the secrets, of the United States. And they wanted to ensure that secure operating systems are also widely available. So they helped and developed pretty much specific security functionality within Linux. So they created something which is called SE Linux, and it became now essential functionality within Linux, initiated through a customer. Again, and then donated kind of the code to the community, in which in the meantime, SE Linux is within Linux already for at least the last 3, 4, even 5 years. Okay, very interesting example. So, bottom line is that open source as a software development model helps us and others make better software faster at a lower cost. And this is also, again, one reason to close the gap between the high demand and the limiting budget. So next, let me talk about the business model, because it's complex. If you look at a traditional license company, how does a traditional proprietary license company make money? They make money by selling licenses. How do they make more money? By selling more licenses. Okay? So what actually happens, which is a normal thing in the industry, is that they have to resell the licenses to the same customers over and over again. So how do you do this? So they have a release, or they have a version, and then they have maybe some point releases where they cannot charge money. So they know, okay, I have to somehow make my release next version bigger. I have to get requirements from industry, whatever, from the financial services industry and from the telco industry and from the whatever travel industry. And they put new features in, and they more or less blow up the version so that they can justify, oh, I have now a new version and I can charge money for it and I can force my customers to upgrade. That's just kind of the business model, and there's, I'm sure, many in here who already got forced or did an upgrade of the software where they didn't want to. Okay? And we think there's fundamentally something wrong in this business model around licensing. And then especially when you think of what's happening in industry with all the consolidations, where it gets quite complex, where you as a customer often don't even know anymore, what are you buying? What are you paying for? Okay? Because it's really all intermingled, in a complex structure. So we are convinced that a fundamental change in the business model will make a big difference. When you look at the business model of Red Hat or other open source companies, it's about adding value to free functionality. We don't sell functionality. Functionality is for free. So if open source companies think they sell functionality, they will not be successful, because the functionality is for free. So we have to find a model where we add value to the free functionality, where you as a customer are willing to pay money for. So we have a subscription-based model where then we add putting specific added values around the free technology. What's the key difference with this is that, first of all, you don't pay a big license fee, that's one thing. But more important is that we have to prove ourselves on an ongoing basis that we are worth the money you're paying us, because your exit cost is extremely low. There's never an exit cost of zero, but there's an extremely low exit cost because open source software is always based completely on standards. You don't have a financial lock-in from having it on your books because it was capitalized, and you don't have a technology lock-in. So the exit cost is very, very low, and because you have a subscription which ends at a certain term, customers can decide if they want to renew with us or not. Okay? If we want to stay in business, we have to demonstrate that we are worth the money and that we really presented value so that the customer renews. So this fundamental difference in the business model, drives us to really provide value to you as an end customer, and not, trying to leverage a situation where we know you are locked in and I can just increase prices. And of price increases in the industry, in our industry, are very common, and very often they're not justified at all. And companies are doing this just because they can. Okay? We cannot, because the model doesn't allow it. Okay? So the exit cost is extremely low. So this is I think the second very important element to reduce the gap between the high demand and the low budget. Third is everything around cloud, which I will get into a second, talk about more detail about cloud architectures and how we see this and how we are positioned. But before I go there, I want to a little bit recap and show you how did we as a company do, now in the prior years and currently with more open source software solutions in our open source based, subscription based business model before we go into the cloud details. So this shows you our revenue and our cash balance over the last couple of years, where you see that we as a company are quite successful, and we're growing roughly 20% in average per year. And if you do the math, on top of the last bar, then you will see that we will end up this fiscal year, a little bit below $900 million, which means next year we will hit the famous $1 billion mark, as from a revenue perspective. There's a reason for us as a company growing. There's a reason for why we have events, with this great attendance. In prior years, the attendance was not even half or not even one third, because more and more people and customers recognize there is true value in what open source software and open source software-based companies are providing to the end customer. So I think that's a good documentation. Give you some details. I don't want to do too much commercial about Red Hat, about us, so you get a little flavor where we stand today. We are present in 29 countries around the world, with 14 in EMEA. We have roughly close to 3,500 people worldwide, with a little bit over 900 in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. When I joined the company 7.5 years ago, we were not even 100 people in Europe. We are around 600 worldwide. We are growing with roughly 100 people. Organic net new growth on a quarterly basis, okay? And this is even accelerating again. I currently, just to give an example, have 50 plus of open positions just in Europe. So somebody's looking for a job, so don't approach me later on. Not all in Holland, it's pretty much around my territory. We did $220 million revenue in our last fiscal quarter, which again was a 20% growth. My area represents 25% of the worldwide business. We have roughly a little bit over $1 billion cash in the bank, which is an important element because we are a platform